During the dying days of 1895, the American Treasury's vaults echoed with a terrifying emptiness. The bedrock of the nation's currency was crumbling. Insolvency was merely days away, and a paralyzed legislature left the executive branch entirely powerless to stop the bleeding. Foreign investors stood ready to liquidate their American holdings, threatening to plunge the nation into total economic darkness. It took a solitary, unelected financier stepping through the doors of the executive mansion to halt the impending ruin with one decisive communication. His intervention was not an act of noble patriotism. He threw a lifeline to the Republic simply because his own vast dominion was too intertwined with the nation. Survival to let it drown by the eve of the First World War. This single individual had established a stranglehold over a staggering 1/4 of the total asset valuation within the United States. He did not merely dominate the banking sector. He possessed a terrifying cross-section of the entire industrial machine. Transportation networks, foundries, maritime fleets, risk underwriting firms, and massive manufacturing conglomerates, all bent to his will. Congressional probes eventually uncovered that he and his closest lieutenants occupied 341 seats on the boards of 112 distinct corporate behemoths. The combined weight of these entities was an unfathomable $222 billion at the time, a figure eclipsing $670 billion in our current era. Yet his authentic reach dwarfed even those numbers when he issued a directive. Global exchanges shuddered. When he allocated capital, entire industries shifted course. And when he severed access to liquidity, massive enterprises simply ceased to exist. The invisible architecture he drafted, the institutional safety nets he engineered, and the central banking apparatus he conceptualized did not perish with his passing in the early 20th century. They mutated, they expanded, and they are the exact mechanisms dictating your financial reality in this very moment. The monthly tribute you pay for your shelter flows through a pipeline he laid down. The colossal corporate rescues of modern times are executed using his exact crisis management blueprint. Today's unassailable financial conglomerates are the direct offspring of his original syndicate. The very institution that generates your fiat currency was sketched out in the shadows of his personal study. When the next inevitable market collapse arrives, the remedies deployed will be the exact maneuvers he field-tested over a century ago. He was far more than a titan of lending. He was the master architect of disaster-driven capitalism. He forged a paradigm where financial houses balloon to such grotesque proportions and become so deeply braided together that the state becomes a hostage obligated to underwrite their survival. It is an ecosystem where unelected capital allocators dictate conditions to lawmakers and where a singular whim can rescue or ravage the broader economy. Escaping this web is impossible because the true trap is not the man himself, but the methodology he perfected, the weaponization of centralized wealth. If you are joining us here at The Economic of Fallen Empires, you already know that history's true masters rarely hold political office. We are going to deconstruct exactly how he leveraged sheer panic to build a monopoly, how he orchestrated the birth of the central bank behind closed doors, and why his ghost continues to govern your wallet over a century after his funeral. Born in the spring of 1837 in Hartford, Connecticut, he was not a self-made pioneer forging a path out of poverty. His father was a deeply established financial force in London, gifting him the keys to a sprawling international syndicate. However, while he inherited the tools, the terrifying concentration of authority he subsequently built was a product of his own ruthless ingenuity. Entering his father's London operation as a teenager, he soon launched its New York outpost, and by his early 30s, he had forged a new powerhouse alliance that would eventually bear his iconic name. From his earliest days, he recognized a fundamental truth: authentic supremacy did not stem from extending credit to enterprises. True power was derived from suffocating them, restructuring them, and absorbing them. His inaugural conquest was the massive, chaotic web of the American railway system. Throughout the late 19th century, the transportation sector was a bloodbath. of cutthroat undercutting, rampant overextension, and cyclical ruin. While conventional lenders fled from the volatility, he saw the ultimate choke point. The iron horse moved the lifeblood of the republic. Coal, raw iron, grain, and human labor command the tracks, and you hold the nation's commerce by the throat. He systematically targeted insolvent rail networks, stepping in as the ultimate savior. But his capital was heavily armed with brutal stipulations. He demanded the authority to handpick the leadership, inserting his own loyalists into the highest offices. He seized total control over logistics, pathways, and tariffs, rendering the railway his absolute property in practice, if not on paper. He then strong-armed rival factions into massive region-dominating cartels. By the dawn of the 20th century, he effectively dictated the movements of half the railway mileage across the continent. This was no mere enterprise. It was an absolute monopoly on movement. But his ambition did not stop at the tracks. He sought to own the very cargo those tracks carried. After backing the dominant forces in metallurgy, he orchestrated the most colossal corporate buyout the world had ever witnessed at the dawn of 1901. Swallowing the reigning steel empire for nearly $500 million, he fused it with remaining competitors to birth the planet's first billion-dollar juggernaut, commanding over two-thirds of the nation's steel output. He now sat at the apex of the foundries, the trains that transported the metal, and the vaults that underwrote the entire operation. It was a staggering vertical dominance that made even the oil barons envious. Yet his most chilling talent was not corporate assembly. It was the weaponization of economic terror. The definitive showcase of this dark art was the devastating market collapse of 1907. At the time, the domestic economy was roaring, but fundamentally hollow. Trust institutions operating in a regulatory blind spot had overextended themselves recklessly when a massive speculative gamble on raw materials imploded that autumn. One of the premier trust houses in New York was unmasked as totally insolvent. A contagion of terror swept the streets. Citizens besieged teller windows, demanding physical currency that the system simply did not possess in such massive immediate quantities. This sudden evaporation of liquidity paralyzed the financial engine completely, and Washington lacked any tools to restart it. With no federal lender of last resort in existence, the epicenter of American survival shifted to a private Madison Avenue library. There a 70-year-old patriarch leisurely arranged, playing cards while summoning the elite guardians of the city's vaults. One after another, they surrendered their ledgers to his scrutiny. He sat in judgment, playing the role of economic deity, decreeing which firms would be thrown a lifeline, and which would be cast into oblivion. For the chosen survivors, he ruthlessly extorted capital from healthier institutions and rival tycoons to construct a bulwark of liquidity, threatening permanent exile from the credit markets for anyone who dared refuse him. Though devoid of any elected mandate, he operated as the sovereign central bank of the republic. For a fortnight, he commanded the battlefield, funneling cash to the favored, forcing the weak to surrender to the strong, and ensuring the exchanges did not totally vaporize. The chaos eventually subsided, cementing his legacy as the republic's savior. But the hidden truth of the rescue was its staggering profitability for the savior himself. When the smoke cleared, his own entities had devoured their rivals. His steel conglomerate had swallowed a massive competitor at a fraction of its true worth. The ecosystem was purged of his challengers, leaving his supremacy absolute. This terrifying display of unilateral command sent a shockwave through the public consciousness. A single private citizen held the detonator to the American economy. Had he chosen to withhold his grace, the entire house of cards would have burned. The ensuing outrage triggered intense legislative scrutiny. Government watchdogs confirmed that this tight-knit circle of financiers governed the lifeblood of the nation, prompting desperate outcries for sweeping systemic reform. The public demanded a sovereign financial shield to dethrone these private monarchs. The resulting solution, however, was history's greatest sleight of hand. The central banking apparatus that emerged was secretly drafted by the very titans it was meant to cage in the waning months of 1910. A clandestine party of 6 men boarded a private train car bound for a secluded island off the Georgia coast. Operating under strict anonymity, this elite gathering included his most trusted lieutenants, allied senators, and representatives of international banking dynasties. For over a week, this private cartel authored the blueprint for the nation's financial oversight. The framework they engineered was eventually rubber-stamped into law while packaged as a public institution. Dedicated to economic tranquility, it operated covertly as a banking syndicate owned by its very subjects. Structured as a corporate entity, its primary shareholders were the apex financial houses, his own institutions standing at the front of the line. The terrifying authority to materialize currency and dispense it during disasters, the very power he had wielded as an autocrat in 1907, was now permanently institutionalized. The poachers had literally designed the game preserve. This ancient architecture is the exact invisible cage you navigate today. When the catastrophic housing implosion leveled the global markets in 2008, the state and the central bank simply dusted off the 1907 tactical manual. The apex predators were declared indispensable and flooded with capital. Struggling entities were force-fed to the titans at absolute bargain prices. The descendants of his original empire swallowed up failing giants emerging from the carnage, significantly fatter and vastly more powerful. Today, the modern incarnation of his banking house sits upon nearly $4 trillion in wealth, reigning as the undisputed titan of American finance. Its current chief executive operates as the spiritual successor to the founder. During the unprecedented lockdowns and subsequent banking tremors of recent years, this executive was actively coordinating with the highest levels of the federal government to orchestrate the response, ultimately absorbing yet another collapsing institution under federal blessing. The cycle is eternal engineering rescue, absorbing the weak and emerging untouchable. If you want to understand how this matrix drains your personal wealth right now, look at your housing debt. A massive percentage of the mortgage industry is controlled by the direct heirs of his early 20th century consolidations. When you surrender 2 to 3 times the value of your property in pure interest over the decades, you are functioning precisely as the machine intends this. Perfectly legal, totally normalized. Extraction transfers oceans of wealth from the working class to the vaults every single year. Your retirement vehicle is chained to the same engine. The mutual fund and pension frameworks are the offspring of that same era of monopolization. The subtle annual management fees hovering around 1 or 2% silently siphon hundreds of thousands of dollars from your lifelong accumulations directly into the hands of the financial elite. And when the inevitable market fractures occur, your portfolio bleeds out while the architects are thrown federal life preservers. They privatize the windfalls and socialize the devastation. You absorb the impact, they consolidate the board. Furthermore, the central bank engineered on that isolated Georgia island continuously dilutes your savings through inflation. As your cash holdings bleed purchasing power year after year, that wealth does not evaporate. It is transferred to the massive institutional borrowers who leverage cheap federal capital to generate massive yields. Your slow impoverishment is their reliable profit margin. To fully grasp the inescapable nature of this paradigm, you must examine the 3 historical junctures where the founder personally bailed out. Washington first in 1895, when the federal gold reserves plummeted below critical thresholds, threatening catastrophic default. The legislature was paralyzed until the financier arrived offering to restock the vaults. In exchange for sovereign bonds at a steep discount, he dictated the terms, rescued the state, and walked away with a massive windfall, cementing the chilling reality that in times of existential threat, Washington answers to him. The second rescue was the aforementioned 1907 panic, where he functioned as a one-man central bank. Yet what is often omitted is that during this chaos, he was facing severe federal antitrust scrutiny. By offering to halt the market collapse, he secured implicit presidential immunity to absorb his rivals without government interference. It established the permanent bargain the state shields the titans because the state relies on the titans to keep the sky from falling. The third and most enduring bailout was the aggressive lobbying effort that birthed the central bank itself. By ensuring the Federal Reserve was structured to protect bank solvency above all else, and armed with the power of infinite liquidity, he crafted a permanent state-sponsored rescue mechanism for his own industry. This mechanism has since deployed the parachute for the banking class in every major crash over the last century. The true brilliance of his reign was its shadowy nature. He detested the spotlight, understanding that overt dominance invites resistance, while invisible control multiplies unchecked. When hauled before lawmakers in his final years and asked if capital was the foundation of credit, he famously retorted that character was the ultimate currency, that trust superseded money. While lauded as an honorable sentiment, it was a terrifying admission. His power was not derived from the depth of his pockets, but from his supreme positioning in the darkest hours. Institutions did not look for the deepest vaults. They looked for the man capable of orchestrating the survival of the herd. This exact dynamic rules our modern crisis. During the 2008 meltdown, the fate of the global economy was not decided in public hearings, but on encrypted calls between federal chairs and the chief executives of the megabanks. The titans instructed the state on which rivals to execute and which to place on life support. The government did not regulate the market. The market directed the government to protect the market. Why must the state inevitably bend the knee? Because these entities have deliberately engineered themselves to be indispensable. The apex institutions are lashed together by tens of trillions of dollars in synthetic derivative bets. If a single pillar cracks, the resulting chain reaction of defaulted obligations would incinerate the entire global credit network in a matter of hours. This counterparty risk ensures they operate as a single indestructible organism. The founder recognized this collective invulnerability a century ago, and his modern successors have weaponized it to an apocalyptic degree. It is crucial to recognize that this is not a shadowy conspiracy of villains plotting in smoke-filled rooms. It is the cold mechanical reality of capitalism where competition inevitably yields to concentration. He merely positioned himself at the absolute center of this gravitational pull, and the central bank forever institutionalized his strategy. So how does one exist within a cage with no exits? You are presented with three distinct pathways. The first is passive surrender. You accept that. Institutional extraction and massive bailouts are simply the weather of modern finance. You utilize the credit systems, pay the required tolls, and enjoy the baseline stability. It offers sparing yourself the exhaustion of resistance. The second pathway is defensive starvation. You aggressively eliminate your debts to cut off the interest pipeline. You utilize grassroots credit unions, rely on purely passive indexing to evade management fees, and park your surplus. Capital in tangible assets, precious metals, property, or decentralized ledgers, far beyond the reach of the centralized banking claw. You minimize the surface area they can feed upon. The third pathway is to join the architects. If the system is explicitly designed to transfer public wealth into the vaults of a few immortal institutions during every cyclical crisis, you acquire equity in those institutions. When the state inevitably subsidizes their blunders, you stand alongside them as a shareholder, embracing a purely pragmatic, if morally vacant alignment with the inevitable victors. When the founder drew his final breath in the spring of 1913, his personal estate was valued at a relatively modest sum compared to the oil barons of his era. Yet those peers fundamentally misunderstood the nature of his empire. He did not seek to hoard the currency. He sought absolute dominion over the plumbing through which all currency flowed. Today, the leading four financial syndicates command an astonishing $11 trillion, dwarfing the economic output of sovereign nations. They are the living, breathing manifestation of his ancient blueprint. Too interwoven to untangle, too colossal to let collapse, and constantly expanding through every disaster. You cannot step outside of the architecture he designed. It holds your debts. It manages your future, and it dictates the value of the paper in your pocket. As we continually explore here at The Economic of Fallen Empires, recognizing the boundaries of the cage is the prerequisite for navigating it. He authored the doctrine of crisis capitalism and institutionalized the socializing of financial ruin. You live inside his masterpiece. Welcome to the real world.